Hack and slash games are amazing works of game design. They are simultaneously games that feel very elegant to play and yet also allow for an incredible level of player expression. That marriage of vibes, it's not an easy one, and it takes a lot of work from developers to get those games to that point. What I'm really trying to say is, game development is friggin' hard! Hello, sorry about that. It's me, Gator Soup, back again, and I've been hard at work on Occultation, my 3D horror hack and slash game inspired by and set during the Renaissance. And much like the humans in my game, I am slowly being driven insane. I'm just kidding. I was never sane, but I have been rather productive. Since the last devlog, I have done a ton of lore, world building, and story work on the game, as well as a lot of game design and planning for 2025. But that's a different video. What's important to all of you is that I have put a decent chunk of work into the game and its prototypes. I especially spent a lot of time on the Radiance System and other related components. So that's what we're going to talk about today. But before we get into that, I do want to talk a little bit about game feel. Now, a major objective of any action game, but especially a character action game, is to have good combat. And for combat to feel good, it needs to be smooth, functional, easy to use, and predictable. Essentially, it needs to be elegant. And right now, Occultation's combat feels about as elegant as a moldy potato during girl dinner. It's clunky and honestly rather hard to control. Aiming the character via the camera while managing your combos is just totally not it. Now, thankfully, there is an easy and simple solution that I've come up with. That's right, with enough radiation, you too can grow an additional thumb, dramatically improving your playing skills. However, in lieu of the rampant, unethical, radioactive cataclysm that would be required to produce a bunch of people with additional thumbs, I am forced to make a more realistic solution. A solution that is logical and relatively radiation-free. I'm talking about character snapping. Is that what that's actually called? You know what? That doesn't matter. It gets the job done. For those that don't know, character snapping, as I'm calling it, is a rather simple quality of life feature that can be found in most, if not all, character action games. Essentially, when the player launches an attack, the player character is sometimes reoriented to ensure that the attack lands on the nearest enemy given a set of limitations and parameters, such as distance and radius. It's basically auto-aim, but for melee games. Ooh, that kind of rhymed. Now, with such an obvious solution, the main source of challenge becomes how much character snapping do I need, and what are the rules for that snapping? The most obvious rule is that when a player is already facing an enemy, they should not snap to another enemy. But outside of that, there are a lot of options on the table. For example, another good question would be, how much snapping is allowed, and how wide is that radius? On one end of the spectrum, you have little-known games like Batman Arkham Asylum, Game of the Year winner 2009, where as the player builds up combat momentum, their snap radius for attacks expands dramatically, and Batman becomes a literal batarang homing missile flying across the room, hitting enemies. On the other hand, you have games like Devil May Cry 3, which while still generous with their snapping, are far more reserved. In Devil May Cry 3, Dante doesn't significantly move when he snaps to a new target. At most, he'll turn around. In fact, Dante can actually still miss enemies if they are not within a short distance of him. So, for Occultation, I decided that I wanted to go with character snapping more similar to what is found in Devil May Cry 3. I love Batman Arkham Asylum, but it's not within the tone of my game for my character to be flying around like that. And quite frankly, it was pretty easy to implement. For the snap radius, I just added an area collider to the player that updates a list whenever an enemy collision body enters or exits the area. And that was at least half the solution, because as I mentioned, it's not enough to just snap for every attack to the nearest enemy. If anything, that would actually make things worse. It is essential that if the player is already attacking an enemy and hitting that enemy should remain the target till they are knocked down or dead. To do this, I just added a Raycast 3D to the front of the player character. Now, before any snap, the game checks if there is not already a target. Easy peasy. Now, admittedly, this iteration of character snapping is a pretty bare bones implementation, and I am definitely considering other snapping parameters such as priority based on enemy type and enemy activity. i.e. when an enemy is about to launch a special attack. You might wonder why I would do something like that, and it's because when the player is adjacent but not facing a mess of enemies, it would be pretty frustrating if an enemy telegraphs their special attack and the player snaps to a completely different enemy when they ideally wanted to hit or block the attacking enemy. Essentially, what I'm considering is trying to respect the player's intent, knowing that they would definitely want to react to the attacking enemy first and foremost. Now obviously this is theoretical, but it is something that I'm thinking about. So let's move on. Now, it might seem silly to have worked on something like this at this early stage of the game, but I don't think so. A big part of prototyping is finding the fun, and if the thorns are preventing you from sniffing the roses, then you trim them. The same is true of game development. I think it was a good choice because it immediately improved the game feel, and it gave me and my playtester a much clearer sense of what is and what is not working in combat. Speaking of combat, and with game feel out of the way, let's move on to the real meat and potatoes of this devlog, the Radiance System. Now, for those who are new here and didn't watch my last devlog, I have linked it in the corner, but don't worry, I'm also going to give a quick summary of the Radiance System right now. The Radiance System is Occultation's answer to the mana system, but unlike most mana systems, the Radiance System is a dual-use mana system, with active uses and passive uses. The active uses are fairly standard. As the player builds up Radiance points by landing hits, they can spend those points to activate special attacks. Bit like a PB&J sandwich. It's a classic. In contrast, the passive uses are far more unique. They're like a PB&J but with an extra layer of cream cheese in the middle. Hey, don't knock it till you try it. You see, as the player builds up Radiance, they fill up tiers. As the tiers fill up, passive buffs are activated, modifying and adding additional effects to the player's attacks and movement. It's a really cool idea, if I do say so myself. The only problem was that, broadly speaking, the passive part of the Radiance system was almost completely theoretical, at least from a mechanical perspective. So, the time had naturally come to actually implement it. But adding all of these possible special effects without really knowing what they all were sounded like it would have drastically muddied up my combat code. So it made sense to use a modular approach where I could add and change the buffs without breaking the rest of the code. Now, if only there were a modular way to write code so that we could just plug in the code only when we needed it and it was easily swappable. I mean, who would have thought that maybe we could just, who am I kidding? If you've watched my videos, you know where this is going. I wrote a new finite state machine where each state is a buff with the desired behaviors. Now a quick refresher. For those who do not know, a finite state machine is a coding paradigm where the intended behaviors are isolated to specific scripts called states and are used only when certain criteria are met. In the case of Occultation, this was fairly easy to implement and it was effective, and I was able to add 4 buffs to start with, including a basic damage buff, a buff that traps enemies in place after a certain number of hits, one that inflicts burning damage with a chance of the enemies bursting into an inferno, and a final buff that saps the health from enemies and gives it to the player. Obviously, these buffs were just a test, and they do not look like much visually, but they were really fun to implement, and they did make me realize something. I did not anticipate the amount of additional code that would be required for the enemies to handle and make these effects work. Never mind all of the edge cases for when the effects change midway through a combo. Seriously, it very quickly became a real headache, and just like before with the player character, there was a real risk of creating a giant mess of code, this time on the enemies. But, thankfully, I found a solution. Well, I recycled a solution. That's right, I used another finite state machine. Again, am I a one-trick pony? No matter, even with another finite state machine, the headaches of this system were not immediately resolved, and I had to do a lot of work to separate what was an effect state that should interrupt enemy behavior versus one that should run in tandem with or parallel to existing enemy behaviors. In the end, I opted to have all the effects reside in their own state machine and then just have the ones that affect broader enemy behavior interact with the enemy behavior state machine. For example, the trapping state is not solely an effect state, but a behavior state. Once enough hits have been landed, this effect should activate, and during that time the enemy shouldn't be able to do anything because they're trapped. This is an effect that modifies behavior. In contrast, the sapping ability is exclusively in effect and it does not alter enemy behavior. The enemy that is affected just loses health to the player. This split between an effect state machine and a behavior state machine has ended up working really well, and now things are working as expected. So yeah, buffs are a thing now, and they're honestly really fun to play with. They don't look like much yet, but there's something special about them, and it's already fun to play with them and interact with them in the game, and I can't wait to get this into the hands of more people. Now, as I said at the start of the video, a big part of the appeal of character action or hack and slash games is the amount of player expression they allow for. Traditionally, almost all of that expression comes through the player's move kit, or is it called an attack kit since it's fighting? I'm not sure. Regardless, I totally want a great move kit that allows players to express themselves, but I don't want to stop there. I also want them to be able to make crazy builds. This is why I'm adding the buffs, to allow greater player expression. I want to make a character action game where the players can not only express themselves through combos, but through exceptional, borderline, game-breaking builds. The buffs will allow the player to do that, but for it to work, the player needs to be able to customize their builds and swap out which buffs they want to use. Essentially, I needed to create a customization system, but I didn't know how to build it. Like, don't get me wrong, I knew what I needed. I needed a menu screen. I just have very little UI experience and have never had to do anything with player customization before. Seriously, most of my games have avoided UI. On the plus side though, this has turned out to be a genuinely good learning experience so far. I really had to think about it and plan it out, even though this was just a prototype. Now, what I wanted for the menu was to have 2 UI bars, one for the tiers and one for the possible buffs, where the player could select a buff and then add it to the tier list. I tried a variety of ways, but it was ending up a lot more complicated than I intended. So I did what any good dev does. I cheated. I went online and watched how other people solved similar problems. And I learned that Godot actually has a UI element called an item list. And had I actually read the UI section of the Godot documentation, I would have realized it is actually exactly what I needed the whole damn time. Thus, with some additional scripts and tweaking, I was actually able to use these item lists for the desired menu system. I was able to make it so that the player can select a buff and then add that buff to the tier list. Not only that, but I made it so that the player could move the buff around and change which tier it was attached to. All in all, this was actually really fun, and there's a good bit under the hood that I can build off going forward. Now, the UX is not great, but it is a start. Of course, there remained one final, albeit small, wrinkle. All of this UI did not actually connect to the player or their buffs. So now it was time to connect them. I decided to create a name system linking the buffs to their UI counterparts. Now, all of the buffs that are available to the player are stored in the state machine, and then the buff manager, which parents the state machine, is called whenever a change in the UI has occurred. A reference to the state is then put in a designated tier position on the buff manager to be called when that tier is activated. And this actually worked. Now I can, with relative ease, add new buffs and allow the player to customize which ones they're using. Now, it might seem silly, but this is a huge milestone for me. This was one of the last parts of the Radiance system that I needed to prototype, and honestly, I am so thrilled with how it's turned out. Getting the Radiance system working was one of those big ideas for Occultation, and I'm really happy that I finally got to it. I'm not even joking, I have been stewing on it for so long, and honestly, it's turned out better than I could have hoped. I have so many crazy ideas for buffs that I genuinely cannot wait to keep working on it. I might just need to find a better name than buffs. And I think that's it for this devlog. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you to my very first patron. These videos are a lot of work, and it makes me so happy to see people enjoying them and supporting them. Thank you so much. If you have any feedback or comments, by all means, fire away. If you want to follow along, please consider subscribing, joining the Discord, or even joining the Patreon. Thanks again for watching, and see you in the new year. Happy holidays, everybody.